In a recent video, I briefly mentioned how oftentimes there are those within the spiritual community that can be quite judgmental, and I thought I would spend a little more time going a little more deeply into this, because I know that this is a common issue for many people. Over the years, I've heard many people complain about this sort of thing, complain about people within the spiritual community being overly critical of others, being demeaning or condescending, or perhaps behaving with a sort of arrogance. And I've also observed many people behaving in this way and have felt bothered by it at times. And to be honest, I've been on both ends of it. I've often felt that I was being judged by others, but there have also been times when I could be quite judgmental myself. And just to be clear, when we're talking about judgment, what I mean is not merely to observe some unhealthy or unconscious aspect in someone. One can observe these things without passing judgment. But judgment is more a way of evaluating someone, which means that when we judge someone, what we're essentially doing is determining that person's value. Or rather, we're forming some opinion in regard to their value, because actually we don't get to determine other people's value. We only think we do. So our judgment is really nothing more than an opinion. But generally it's an unfavorable opinion. We're not just determining a person's value, but more than that, we're actually devaluing that person. We're considering them to be lesser, to be inferior or inadequate, or perhaps even worthless in some regard. And in terms of what we're talking about here more specifically, generally the judgment is in regard to how spiritual a person is, or whether they're spiritual at all. And as I said, there tends to be quite a few people within the spiritual community who like to take the position of determining who is spiritual and who isn't, or at least to what degree. Now, a spiritual community is really very much like any other community of people. It's comprised of many different people with many different backgrounds, life experiences, traits, and temperaments, and so on. And spiritual people are really not so different than anyone else. We all show up with our various personal issues, our insecurities, and so on. And that's the whole reason we're there. We show up because we're wanting to work through these things in order to resolve them, and in order to gain a greater understanding of ourselves and to wake up from our illusions. In fact, this is really the only thing that sets so-called spiritual people apart from anyone else. When we say that someone is spiritual, all that really means is that there is some conscious endeavor to wake up. The point being is that a spiritual community is made up of imperfect people who are in the process of waking up. And so there's a lot of room there for criticism if that's your thing. If you're the kind of person who is looking to judge and criticize others, you're going to find a lot of opportunity there. You're going to find a lot of things there to focus that sort of attention on. As I talked about previously, we tend to hold some image or ideal in our mind of what a spiritual person is supposed to be like. And it's usually a very high standard. We might even have very specific attributes in mind, specific traits, specific behaviors, and so on. And when we see that someone is not living up to that standard, we might have the tendency to judge them, to devalue them. And this kind of judgment, by the way, is not always direct. In fact, I would guess that much of the time, we simply keep it to ourselves. And this is something that perhaps we all do or have done at some time or another. And so we notice some flaw in another person's behavior, something that they're doing or not doing, or that in some way they don't measure up to our standard, to our image or ideal of what we think it means to be spiritual. And so we devalue them. We consider them to be less spiritual, or not spiritual enough, or perhaps not spiritual at all. And in devaluing someone, there's also a sort of raising oneself up, a sort of elevating oneself to a position of spiritual superiority. And this could be in regard to just about anything in their behavior, in their lifestyle, in their attitude, which we perceive as being less than ideal. But what we forget, or perhaps we haven't really given much consideration to, is that each of us are on our own individual journeys, and that each of our journeys are unique because we're all coming from different places in our lives. We all have different experiences which have provoked us to take up this spiritual path. And we all have various temperaments, characteristics, and so on. We all have our own personal issues, our own challenges, which may differ depending on our various life experiences. And so we all have different areas of focus depending on where we currently are in life, which is to say that we may all be working on different things at any given time, working to overcome different limitations, illusions, and so on. What I'm saying is that my journey is going to look much different from your journey, and where I am on my journey may be a very different place from where you are on yours. And it's not so much a matter of being greater or lesser or better or worse, but just different, focused on different areas, working through different issues. And so let's suppose that on your journey you've renounced some activity like eating meat or having sex or watching television, or maybe you've renounced some material possessions and taken up a minimalist lifestyle, whatever it happens to be. And you see someone else who is engaged in some spiritual study or practice, who is also still engaging in some of those activities that you've renounced. And we may judge that person. We may consider them inferior. We might think to ourselves, this person isn't really very spiritual. But as I said, everyone's journey is different, and so this other person may simply be at a very different place on their path, focused on something else entirely. Perhaps for them the focus is on overcoming some psychological or emotional issue, like anger or anxiety or what have you. And suppose they've been quite successful at this so far, maybe not entirely, but perhaps there's been a significant improvement in their overall mood, and they're finding themselves much less reactive, much more calm, and not so easily upset. But then they look at you and they notice that you've still got some of those emotional issues that they've since overcome. In fact, perhaps you seem quite angry much of the time. And in seeing that, they might think to themselves, this person isn't very spiritual. So it's all a matter of perspective, depending on where you are. The point, as I was saying, is that we're all at different places on our journey, and not necessarily better or worse, but just different. So we can't expect that everyone else is going to be at the same place that we are, dealing with the same issues or having come to the same realizations. We can't expect that everyone else's journey is going to look the same as ours, that they're going to behave in all the same ways or engage in the same practices or abstain from the same activities and so on. Ultimately, we're all moving toward the same thing, but the path to get there is different for everyone. And even if there are specific areas of insight or realization that we all must come to, we may not come to those realizations at the same time or in the same sequence. But it really isn't for us to determine where another person is on their journey or whether it's where they should be. We don't really know what that person is facing in their own life or where they've been. And we shouldn't be too concerned with where other people are on their journey. We should be much more concerned with where we are on ours. That's where our attention should be. Now, the reason that we tend to judge others is to deflect or distract from our own self-judgment. As I said, none of us are perfect, although some of us may be aspiring for some sort of perfection. And depending on how important that is to us, we may find that we fall short of our own ideal. We may notice many traits and tendencies in ourselves which we find displeasing or disturbing, for which we devalue ourselves. And in order to take our attention away from these things so that we don't feel so ashamed, we focus our attention on someone else's flaws, on someone else's shortcomings. As long as I'm focused on some perceived flaw in you, I don't have to think about my own flaws. I don't have to address those things in myself. I'm too busy worrying about what you're doing or not doing to give attention to my own issues. And if I can find some flaw in you that I don't have, that's even better, because then by comparison, I can feel superior. I can feel that I'm more advanced or evolved or awake or what have you. And I may still have my flaws. I may still have many things in me which I haven't yet resolved, but perhaps by focusing on some flaw that I see in you and then magnifying it, it seems to diminish my own flaws, to make them appear smaller by comparison. But really, when it all comes right down to it, the real reason I feel the need to judge is because I feel some sense of insecurity or inadequacy. It's because essentially I'm judging myself. But if I can judge someone else, if I can convince myself that this other person is lesser than me in some regard, that may not reduce my own sense of inadequacy, but it makes it seem smaller by comparison. And that seems to offer me some temporary feeling of relief. And it's not simply that I have some flaw or imperfection in my character, because we all do. None of us are perfect, but rather it's the fact that I'm unable or unwilling to accept it. But when I do come to accept these things in myself, I find that I'm far more accepting of others, far more understanding and forgiving, and not so compelled to judge. So I look at the other and I might observe that they have some area where they're struggling, or some issue that's causing them to suffer, or some area in which they may still be unconscious. But rather than devalue them for it, I might instead feel compassion, because perhaps I've been there myself, or perhaps I simply understand that we all have our own personal issues, we all have our own personal struggles. I understand that we're all at different places on our journey, and just because someone hasn't yet arrived at some particular point, at some particular realization, doesn't mean that they're any less spiritual. If they're really sincere in their endeavor, they'll get there all in their own time. But perhaps right now, they're focused on something else. And perhaps whatever that happens to be, it's exactly what they need to be focusing their attention on at the moment. You see, that's the thing. We can't presume to know better than others where they're supposed to be on their journey. And perhaps wherever a person happens to be at any given moment is exactly where they're supposed to be at this moment on their journey. So even if we happen to observe that someone is very judgmental, and that they're often criticizing others or behaving with a kind of arrogance, well, that's just where they happen to be on their own journey. And we can just allow them to be in that place. We don't have to take any of it personally. We don't have to be offended by it, because perhaps we can simply understand that their need to judge is a way of coping with their own insecurities. And until they resolve those insecurities, we shouldn't expect anything different from them. So perhaps we can simply have compassion. And if we do happen to find ourselves offended by it, or taking it personally, feeling upset about it, well, perhaps that's just where we are on our journey. But instead of focusing our attention on them and what they're doing, we can turn it back upon ourselves and ask, why does this offend me? Why does it bother me so much? Why do I find myself disturbed by this person's criticism? What is it in me that feels disturbed? Maybe I have my own insecurities that I need to bring awareness to. I remember a time early on in my journey when I was just beginning to go out and engage in various spiritual communities, going to different churches and temples and other kinds of spiritual gatherings and events. And I remember how I would often feel as if others were judging me, evaluating me, looking down on me, and it was very uncomfortable. And not that many people had overtly said anything to me that was particularly criticizing or demeaning. It was usually just the way others would sometimes look at me. But eventually it occurred to me that perhaps I was just misinterpreting their expressions. Maybe some of those blank stares were nothing more than curiosity. After all, none of those people had actually said anything to me, so I couldn't really know what they were thinking. I just assumed that it was a kind of judgment. And perhaps in some cases, some of those people were judging me, but how was I to know? And more importantly, why did it even matter? Because what I really came to recognize was that the reason I often felt judged was because someone was indeed judging me, and that person was me. Oftentimes, our own self-judgment is our own sense of inadequacy or imperfection that we project out onto others in such a way that it appears to be coming from them, even though they may have no judgment about us whatsoever. It's just that our own self-judgment causes us to interpret their expressions, their words, and so on, as if they're judging us. But even if someone is judging us, could it be that the only reason it bothers us is because somewhere deep down, perhaps, we agree with their judgment? Perhaps there is some aspect in us that we feel ashamed of, and when we find that someone else is aware of it, we might feel all the more ashamed of it. And when they bring it to our attention, especially if they devalue us because of it, perhaps the reason that we feel so upset is because we tend to agree with that evaluation. So this is also something to be aware of, something to take notice of, and to examine in ourselves. When someone is indeed judging us, criticizing us, devaluing us, or perhaps even dismissing us entirely, it can feel very upsetting. We might feel hurt or rejected, we might feel angry or resentful, we might feel deeply offended. And if we're not very watchful of ourselves, we might even find that we begin criticizing them in return. And not just criticizing, but judging, devaluing, diminishing them. And I found myself in that position many times. I would notice how judgmental someone was being, whether that judgment was directed specifically toward me or to someone else, and I would begin to feel some contempt for them, to devalue them, thinking less of them because of it. And so there I am doing essentially the same thing. I'm judging them for being judgmental, which is essentially a contradiction of itself, because as soon as I pass judgment on them, I'm no better, in which case my judgment has no standing. And that's another thing. Who are we to judge? What makes us so qualified to judge others? Are we so perfect? Are we so flawless and pure that we have some divine authority to devalue others? And if we were so enlightened, would we even judge at all, or would we simply have compassion? So when we might feel compelled to judge others, can we stop for a moment and just reflect on ourselves and see why it is we feel so compelled? Is it our own insecurity? Is it our own self-judgment? Are we just trying to deflect from our own sense of inadequacy? And if we can address that in ourselves, if we can resolve it, then we come away with a greater understanding of why others are so judgmental. And rather than judge them for it, we can simply have understanding and compassion. So again, we're all on our own individual journeys. We're all at different places on our own unique path. And if we really want to make any progress, our attention should be focused on our own journey, where we are at the moment and what needs to be addressed in us at this moment. Not so much concerned with where others might be on their journey, whether they're still unconscious in this way or that. We should be asking ourselves, where might I need to be more conscious? What do I need to be more aware of in myself? What do I need to give more attention to? What am I not attending to in myself that needs to be attended to? Or we might look at what triggers us, at what disturbs us, because that's often the very place where we need to be giving our attention at the moment. Asking ourselves, why does this disturb me? Or why do I react in this way? And how might I respond differently? And so giving our attention in this way to wherever we happen to be on our own individual journey, addressing our own issues, our own insecurities, our own dissatisfaction, and so on. And at the same time, cultivating our values, cultivating greater patience and understanding, compassion, awareness, seeing through our own illusions, letting go of our own limiting beliefs, coming to know and accept ourselves more and more, and letting go of judgment, both in regard to ourselves as well as to others. If you find value in this content, be sure to like, share, and subscribe.